They told him to leave. They told him there was nothing he could do. The man on the ground wasn't moving, wasn't responding, was barely breathing, and in war that usually means one thing: you move on, you survive, you don't look back. But he did the opposite. He turned around, walked back into gunfire, lifted his best friend onto his shoulders, and started walking, not for a few steps, not for a few minutes, but for miles, through freezing cold, through pain,
Get back!
through exhaustion that breaks most men, because to him, leaving his friend behind was never an option.
The Black Archive.
The winter of that year was unforgiving. Men who had grown up in the cold said they had never felt anything like it. The wind didn't just blow. It cut through fabric, through skin, through bone. It found every weakness, every opening, every place where the body tried to hold on to warmth. The ground was hard, frozen solid, covered in layers of snow that had been stepped on, driven over, and stained by days of fighting. Nothing about that place felt alive anymore. Trees stood broken. The sky remained a dull grey. Even sound seemed different, quieter, heavier. This was where they were, stationed far from home, far from anything familiar. Among the many men, there were two who had come to rely on each other more than they ever expected. Thomas Walker and Daniel Hayes. They weren't childhood friends. They didn't grow up in the same town. They didn't even meet until the war had already taken them both from their normal lives. But war has a way of accelerating things. What might take years in civilian life can take days in combat. Shared fear, shared hunger, shared silence. It creates a bond that's difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. Daniel was the kind of man others naturally gravitated toward. He spoke easily, laughed often, and carried with him a sense of normalcy that the others desperately needed. He would talk about home, about warm meals, about music on the radio, about small, ordinary things that felt almost unreal in that environment. Thomas was different, more reserved, more watchful, but he listened, and over time he began to respond. Short sentences at first, then longer conversations. Eventually, stories of his own, things he hadn't planned to share with anyone, in a place where tomorrow was never guaranteed. That kind of connection mattered more than anything. They watched each other's backs. They shared what little they had, and without ever needing to say it directly, they made a quiet promise: if something happened, they wouldn't leave each other behind. The attack came before sunrise. There was no warning, no gradual build-up, just the sudden, violent break of silence. Gunfire cracked through the air, sharp and immediate. Explosions followed seconds later, shaking the ground beneath them. Snow and dirt were thrown into the air, mixing into a thick haze that made it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. Men scrambled from their positions, some still half asleep, others already moving on instinct. Orders were shouted, some clear, others lost in the noise. Thomas grabbed his rifle and moved forward, scanning through the smoke, trying to make sense of what was happening. His first thought wasn't strategy, it wasn't positioning, it was Daniel. He turned, searching through the chaos for a moment. Nothing. Then he saw him, about 20 yards ahead, on the ground, not moving. Time seemed to slow in a way that often happens in moments like that. The sounds didn't disappear. They just became distant, less important. Thomas moved without thinking. He ran. Bullets struck the ground nearby, kicking up snow. Someone shouted for him to get down. Another voice yelled for retreat, but he kept going. When he reached Daniel, the reality became clear almost immediately. He was alive, but barely. There was a deep wound in his leg. Blood had soaked through the fabric and was spreading into the snow beneath him. His breathing was shallow, uneven. His eyes were open, but unfocused. Thomas dropped to his knees. "Stay with me," he said, his voice lower than the chaos around them. Daniel didn't answer, but there was the faintest movement, just enough to know he was still there. Then came the order: "Fall back! Fall back now!" It was repeated several times, louder each time. This wasn't a suggestion, it was survival. Anyone who stayed would be overrun. Thomas looked up. Men were already moving. Some helping the wounded they could carry. Others forced to leave those they couldn't. It was the reality of war. Brutal, unforgiving, necessary. He looked back at Daniel, and in that moment, everything became very simple. He could leave, and live or stay, and risk everything. But for Thomas, the choice didn't feel like a choice at all. Lifting a fully grown man is difficult under normal conditions. Doing it in freezing temperatures, under physical exhaustion, while carrying equipment, is something else entirely. Thomas positioned himself, pulling Daniel's arm over his shoulder, then lifting him with a strain that immediately shot through his back and legs. For a second, he thought he might not be able to do it, but then he adjusted, shifted the weight, stood up, and took the first step. It wasn't fast, it wasn't clean, but it was movement. Behind him, the sounds of battle continued. Ahead of him, there was only uncertainty. He didn't know exactly where the nearest safe position was. He didn't know how far he would have to go. He only knew one thing: he had to keep moving. The cold made everything harder. Each step sank slightly into the snow, forcing him to use more energy than he had. His boots slipped on patches of ice, hidden beneath the surface. The wind pushed against him, slowing his progress even further. Daniel's weight shifted constantly, forcing Thomas to readjust his grip again and again. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Time began to lose meaning. At some point, the sounds of gunfire faded into the distance. There were no more voices, no more commands, just the wind. And the sound of his own breathing, heavy, uneven, strained. Every few steps, he would stop just long enough to tighten his hold, to make sure Daniel hadn't slipped too far. Sometimes, Daniel would murmur something, fragments of words that didn't fully form. Other times, there was nothing at all, and those were the moments Thomas feared the most. "Stay with me," he repeated quietly, not even sure if Daniel could hear him anymore. The human body has limits, clear, defined limits, and yet, in certain moments, it goes beyond them. Not because it can, but because it has to. Thomas felt those limits approaching. His legs trembled, his arms burned, his back ached in a way that felt deep, structural. The cold no longer felt sharp, it felt distant, muted, which was not a good sign. He stumbled once, twice, then finally, he dropped to one knee. Daniel slipped slightly, and Thomas caught him just before he hit the ground completely. For a moment, he stayed there, breathing, trying to gather enough strength to continue everything. In his body told him to stop, to rest, to just stay there, but he knew what that meant. He adjusted his grip. Again, took a breath, and said something he would remember for the rest of his life. "You're not dying here." It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was steady, certain. He stood up again. It could have been an hour, it could have been several. There was no way to tell. The landscape didn't change much. Snow, broken trees, empty space. But eventually, something was different. At first, it was just a shape, then movement, then voices, faint, but real. Thomas tried to call out. Nothing came. His throat was dry, his voice gone. He kept walking, step by step, until his legs finally gave out. He fell forward, still holding Daniel. When he woke up, everything was quiet, warm, still. For a few seconds, he didn't understand where he was. Then he saw the canvas above him, a medical tent, the smell of antiseptic, the low voices of medics nearby. Memory came back slowly, then all at once. He turned his head, ignoring the pain. "Daniel," a medic noticed, came closer. For a moment there was hesitation, and in that hesitation, Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. Then the medic spoke. He made it. Thomas never described the distance. He never calculated how far he had walked. He never tried to explain how he found the strength, because to him, that wasn't the important part. What mattered was simple. When the moment came, he didn't leave, and in a war defined by loss, by separation, by things left unfinished, that was something he could carry with him for the rest of his life, was never an option.